Welcome to the Memory Lab Network's, let's see, what month is it? September 2020, right? Webinar. And today I'm really happy and excited to have Ethan Gates with us. And I am so sorry, Ethan, your position, you are a software preservation coordinator? No.
Analyst. You almost got there.
Wow. Yeah, no, I wouldn't. I wasn't going to.
It's not a job anyone else has, so
Gotcha.
I didn't expect you to.
Very special at Yale Libraries, right? Yeah. So he's going to be talking. Ethan did one for our first cohort, a webinar for our first cohort that was on digital storage, and it's just like I had you guys watch it. It's a fantastic resource for you guys, for me too, for any memory lab. So today he's going to be talking about Emulation 101, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah, it's going to be, if you don't know what that is, that's cool, because I'm sure Ethan's going to cover it all. So I'm going to stop talking and turn off my camera and everything. And Ethan, please take it away.
Sure. So hi, everyone. It's really great to talk to you today, and thanks to Siobhan for inviting me back to speak again. I always love talking with the Memory Lab Network and supporting y'all's work. So yeah, I'm excited today because last time I talked about digital storage, which is more of a general sort of like enthusiasm topic of mine, but today I'm going to be talking about my sort of day-to-day job, which in addition to my official title is software preservation analyst for Yale University Library, but sort of my primary stream of work is on a particular grant-funded project called EASY, or Emulation as a Service Infrastructure. And I'm going to get into what emulation is, what our grant is aimed at doing and working at, and then hopefully get through all of that and leave some time for questions, because honestly, again, as Siobhan says, kind of the point of giving this talk to you all today is that me and my colleagues in digital preservation at Yale and beyond believe that emulation is like an increasingly viable option for collecting institutions or cultural heritage organizations of all stripes, including libraries, to offer access for their patrons to born digital material. And that's we're often talking about data rescued from obsolete media here. So that would include, stuff you pull off of floppies or CD-ROMs files from the 90s, 2000s. And for reasons that I'm going to get into, some background, emulation is like not really yet a commonly implemented strategy in cultural heritage organizations. But that's why basically the title of my talk, which I should just actually get going on sharing my slides here. 1 second. To find the right window again. Share the right desktop. There we go. Is Emulation 101 emulation as a strategy? So I'm not going to be able to tell you everything there is to know about emulation today. That's just not something you can cover in an hour and a half. But I want to give you some tips on basically why you should care, or why you could care about emulation, and sort of when, why, how to dive deeper on this topic. So in order to talk about emulation, it actually helps to back up for a second and think about what a computer is. We are all sitting in front of some sort of laptop or desktop computer right at this moment. And I invite you to sort of, rather than thinking of that as one monolithic device, my computer, to try and break that down a little bit into the different components and pieces that actually make up a computer. So when we talk about computers, in a physical environment, a device sitting in front of you that you can touch, feel, interact with, you're talking about a combination of hardware, which is usually the most visible, again, the most interactive. The pieces, those are the physical devices that we can actually touch and see. Those are your keyboard, your screen, your processor, the actual pieces of plastic and metal that make up a computer. But in order to make those pieces of hardware usable, there are other pieces that come into play, right? Like your operating system. And I call it a bootable system because, again, when we think of an operating system like a Windows 10 or a Mac OS, usually there's actually a lot of things going on there. There's the operating system itself, but there's also the applications that we as users choose to install. There's the file system on which all of your application and device data is stored. There are drivers, which are the pieces of software that help the operating system and your applications communicate with hardware. Again, pieces of plastic and metal aren't going to do anything by themselves. We have to have a way of translating what we as users want in order to talk and perform computing tasks, and that's what drivers do. And all of that together sort of manifests in a physical way on your hard drive, right? Or a solid state drive, as the case may be, probably with a lot of people who are on laptops now. That's all data. That's all zeros and ones, but stored on usually some particular system drive, a particular piece of physical digital storage. And then if we think about the way that we tend, again, to further interact with computers, both historically and now, we tend to move data around, right? Files, whether it's on USB or historically floppies, CD-ROMs, whether it's an external hard drive. Increasingly, the internet, obviously, if not increasingly, if not dominantly now, the way to actually move individual user files and data around. But those are things I sort of separate those out because they are not, I make a separation between bootable software and that sort of like additional software or content, because if you only had a floppy disk without an operating system, you're again not going to be able to make use of your computer. All of these things have to be working together in concert to turn into the computer that you use and hopefully love day to day. So to get from there in terms of like what computing is in general, what a computer is, that leads us more easily into what emulation is. And emulation is a technique whereby computing hardware can be recreated using software, using applications that we call emulators. We can take a piece of metal and plastic that is designed to do a certain thing, and we can, like a processor, and we can recreate that entirely in ones and zeros in the software realm. And what that sort of does as a strategy is allow one computer, like perhaps the Windows 10 PC you have in front of you, to behave like an entirely different computer, whether it's a contemporary MacBook or something older like a 90s PC. So emulation, basically, it's sort of a backwards compatibility or a way to overcome incompatibility and obsolescence. We can take programs, files, data that were designed to be used with one piece of hardware and use them on a different piece of hardware using emulators. And I like to emphasize that emulation is really not either a new technical concept or unique to video gaming. If people have encountered emulation before this talk, or even if you were to go out in the world and to try to talk to people about emulators, almost certainly the first place that anyone has encountered that is in the video gaming world, with people trying to take PlayStations or Nintendo's gaming consoles and allow people to play those games on a computer. And indeed, emulation technology is generally, I can say, pushed forward by the gaming community. They are often the people who work the hardest on this and create the most accurate technology. But again, it's not unique to video gaming. It can be a very general computing concept. If anyone saw the Imitation Game or is familiar with Alan Turing and the story of the bomb device at Bletchley Park in the United Kingdom during World War II, there's a reason why that device or that film is called The Imitation Game. The Alan Turing's computer was meant to essentially be an emulator. It was a device that was meant to imitate and recreate the function of a German Enigma encoder. So again, that's one piece of hardware designed to recreate or imitate a different piece of hardware. And even again, going from there all the way through the history of computing, before personal computers were popular in the 60s, 70s, 80s, IBM and other mainframe and sort of mini computer desktop manufacturers, including like the very popular IBM System 360, which was an extremely influential mainframe computer. Many of these systems included emulation functionality baked into them so that users of a machine like this could run programs and software that was intended for earlier IBM models or even just a different IBM model. Again, so it's just that general concept of taking one computer and making it act like a different computer. So we can do all sorts of things with emulators today. You can run Mac System 6 on Windows 10. You could run Windows 95 on the latest and greatest Mac operating system. And if you're like me and you do this every day and you super get into the weeds with it, you could run the Xerox Alto on your Ubuntu Linux operating system. There's all different kinds of combinations. The point is that emulation is just this really powerful tool for overcoming either backwards compatibility and obsolescence, or just cross-platform compatibility, essentially. And I, in fact, don't generally like to use the word like obsolete platforms or obsolescence when it comes to talking about these sort of like legacy operating systems, like running Windows 95 or old Mac operating systems, because as I'm sure as anyone who's on this call has maybe struggled to ever open an older Microsoft Word file or an older Excel file, as you can attest, it's not that there's no more use or call for these older systems or these older pieces of software that have been replaced. There is still often a purpose for them in our day-to-day lives, but they've been commercially abandoned by their makers, essentially. Just Microsoft and Apple and other developers just don't care to sell you support for these pieces of software because they've moved on to bigger and better and more profitable use cases. So if those companies, if Microsoft or Apple are not going to offer us the backwards compatibility we need to open older files, we have to find alternative solutions like emulation. So in terms of like what an emulated environment, what an emulator looks like, to return to this analogy of a physical computing environment, a physical device sitting in front of you. If we think about each of those pieces, each of these is going to have an equivalent in emulation or in a virtual abstract sense. So rather than pieces of hardware, those pieces of plastic and metal that make your screen, your mouse, your keyboard, your processor, emulator applications are going to cover all of that. That is what they are designed to do, is take care of hardware, while our storage devices are going to be taken care of by files that are usually called disk images. I'm not sure if you all have covered or talked about disk imaging, but it's basically the process of taking a physical storage device, again, like a hard disk drive, like a floppy disk drive, like a CD-ROM, and just copying bit for bit every 1 and 0 off of those physical storage devices and putting them into a file. So, and then there's all sorts of different formats of disk images that carry all sorts of different kinds of extensions and different use cases. Often things like .img images for hard disks or ISO images for CD-ROMs are often encountered. The point is that those storage devices and the sort of everyday files and software and data that you work with as a user of a computer are going to be recreated in disk image form, while emulators handle the hardware. And so I'm going to do again, a quick demo of that sort of in action. Let's see if I can do that. Can you all see a File Explorer window at this point?
Yes.
Yes, great. So in this case, I have an application called Mini VMac, which is designed to emulate older pieces of Apple hardware, mostly from the late 80s, early 90s would generally be the time period that Mini VMac covers. And if I double click on this, this is my application. So that's my emulator application that has now recreated all the hardware. So if I were to press, this is like I have a Macintosh Plus right in front of me and press the power button, this is what I would get. And because at the time, operating systems came entirely on floppies, I have my Mac OS System 6 operating system floppy here. If I drag and drop, we have now just recreated the operating system, the bootable system part of this computer. So I now actually have something that I can interact with, see menus, get information. And then if I want to load in some additional content, like in this case, the original Carmen, Where in the World Was Carmen San Diego, it's basically like I've just taken this disk image, this one file that's representing a floppy disk. I dragged and dropped it on here, and now I can run this program. It's again basically like I just had a physical computer right in front of me. Oh my gosh. Sorry, in my head, the sound just went really loud on that. I don't know if you all can hear that. I hope not. It was way too loud. Apologize for that.
It sounds like nostalgia to me.
Yeah. Yeah, this honestly, I show this off because it's basically my first memory of using a computer, period, is playing Carmen San Diego on our family Macintosh Plus. So I like to recreate that. But again, that's basically, I've just simulated in a couple of clicks with a couple of different files and with an emulator application, the experience of having a physical computer right in front of me and inserting a floppy disk and running programs as we would have at the time. Shut that down. Move back to, oh no, 1 second, sorry, I just lost my slides. Here we go. So just like emulation in general is not a new technology in computing, as I mentioned, this idea of taking what I just showed you and using it as a way for everyday patrons, students, researchers, data curators, librarians, archivists, whoever, to use this technology as an access strategy for digital material in their collections or that their patrons hold. That idea is itself not new in particular either. We can at least go as far back as 1995, and there's a very sort of seminal article on this topic written by Jeff Rothenberg called the Ensuring the Longevity of Digital Information. It was in the January 1995 issue of Scientific American, and there was a clear report that sort of expanded and followed up on it. It's worth reading. That again, I'm not going to say he was the first instance of someone publishing about emulation as an access strategy. For public institutions and cultural heritage institutions, I would certainly like someone to point out to me if there are earlier instances or documents that they can find where people discuss this. But it's probably the document that has most influenced and framed the debates we have today are in the digital preservation community and the emulation world insofar as archives and libraries, and with this problem of software-dependent materials. And when I say software-dependent materials, again, I'm retreating to this core problem that is not even really unique to older digital files. You could have encountered this problem when trying to move something from a Mac computer to a Windows 10 computer yesterday. But what we find is that it's often not enough to maintain digital information or maintain digital files, which is to say, I could copy the exact string of bits and bytes of ones and zeros that make up a file on a floppy or a CD-ROM, get them off of that floppy disk into storage, backed up, did all the right things. But when it comes to actually using and interacting and offering access to that file, as it was originally created and as the user originally intended it to be seen, oftentimes those files are software dependent. They can't be opened, they can't be understood, they can't be used without some particular piece of software, perhaps a particular version of a piece of software that is no longer available, or just for whatever reason is not compatible with the operating system and the software that you are currently running on your desktop. So this is why on our grant project, and even in this slideshow, you've seen me sort of use the term a couple of times already, but we really push this idea of computing in every computer as an environment. It's this combination of hardware and software and data components that are all working in concert with each other to create and display the files, the programs, the everyday experience that we all have in using computers and digital systems. And if you change any one of those pieces, whether you change the hardware, you change the operating system, you change an application, you change a version of an application, you change the settings in an application, it potentially affects the behavior of the entire environment. And I promise I'm getting to the SimSafari metaphor here. So really, I invite you to think here of, let's say, the African savanna here is your Windows 95, and the giraffe is a particular version of Macromedia Flash, or Macromedia Shockwave, as it would have actually been at the time. Each of your feasting gazelles here is like an old version of Internet Explorer that has the Adobe Flash plugin, and every single one of those little blades of grass is a website that featured a Flash animation. And that's all the late 90s, that's all general computing environment in the late 90s. And if you changed or messed with, again, any one of those components or any one of those pieces of the ecosystem, you're potentially affecting how the system behaves and what the other pieces of that puzzle look like. And in general, that Rothenberg piece, and again, in these discussions around what to do, what do we do with software-dependent data? What do we do with software-dependent files? In an archival or a library context moving forward, there are these two strategies that come up again and again. Again, this is the framework that Rothenberg applied and that we still have, which you'll hear is emulation versus migration. And I don't like to think of them as competing, really, strategies. They are both completely valid strategies, just depending on your use case and what you're trying to ultimately do. But migration in that context is the idea of making a copy and converting the file to something that is readable on your current operating system, right? Basically taking an old PowerPoint file, it was originally created in Microsoft Office 2003, but it still opens in Office 365, and I can open and I can save it as a PowerPoint X file rather than a .ppt, and everything seems to go smoothly. That's like a really simple example of migration, and probably a really handy one that will perfectly solve most people's access issues. But when it comes to really getting in the weeds with the history of personal computing, the history of digital materials, the more obscure you get, from like a big example like a Microsoft product like that, you encounter more problems with migration. Again, if you're dealing with a more obscure piece of software that created a more obscure file format, even the ability to convert to a newer format requires the original format to be pretty well documented. It requires conversion software to exist in the first place. And it requires that conversion software to convert acceptably. And, I kind of put that acceptable in quotation marks because what acceptable is highly conditional. What might be acceptable to one person or organization may not be to another, even when they're looking at like the same file or the same software. So that's why we are trying to present and present emulation as an equal and equally likely, equally useful strategy, in that we can work to conserve and recreate the original computing environment and not do any conversion work at all, and just try and open that file in the original combination of software and hardware that it was created in, or at least much closer, or as close as we can get. And by doing so, we're going to hopefully preserve both the context, the kind of like look and feel of old digital files, and their content. And I really like to emphasize the content point here. And I'm going to use this example. It's from a study that was done by Archives New Zealand in about 2010, which is going to explain why the examples are in Windows Vista, but they still hold up. This behavior would probably look similar, if not worse, in Windows 10. But what we're basically looking at here is a WordPerfect file. In fact, specifically a WordPerfect Windows Document 6.0 file, the .wp6, as shown in its original environment, which is to say in the Corel WordPerfect software running in Windows 95. And then you can see what happens if you try to open that in an open source conversion tool, a newer word processor, LibreOffice. And you can see that not only have we lost that kind of like look and feel of interacting with this document in Windows 95's menus with all the fun chunky buttons and everything, so we've lost some contextual information there. But there's also just actively data not rendering here. It's not accessible. We have lost part of what that file was supposed to be when it was presented and used. So when looking at an example like this and seeing an example of where migration goes wrong, what we're trying to work towards on this project is to say, okay, rather than spending more time trying to migrate this file more acceptably, why don't we just, using emulation, offer up Windows 95, offer up the WordPerfect 6 software and this file, and be much less concerned when we're offering access about the intrusion that we possibly do with the migration strategy. However, there are complexities. Basically, like why, let's say it's 25 years after that Jeff Rothenberg article at the very least. So why is it 2020? Why, even though hopefully, be convincing a fairly convincing example here of why emulation would be a successful strategy, why is it still pretty rare that you will see it at archives, at libraries, at cultural heritage organizations? And there's a bunch of different reasons. Usability is a big one. Emulator applications are frequently open source tools developed by volunteer enthusiast communities online, by retro computing or those video game like hobbyists that I sort of mentioned at the top of this presentation. They tend not to be commercial products with the support teams and then all that comes with that from big ticket applications. They are not made specifically for archives and information professionals or librarians. And so the documentation that's out there for using and setting them up on sort of a day-to-day basis, it frequently leaves something to be desired for those of us with day jobs who are just trying to figure out, what do I do with this file that I pulled off of a floppy? And even once you figure out how to use these applications and you figured out how to use emulators, you've got all the pieces in place, you've followed the instructions, you've got it set up. There's a scale question here that often limits us, which is that you are limited to the computer that you set up that emulator on. Your patron, your end user, your researcher, whoever it is who again is trying to get access to that older digital material, to that older digital collection, they have to use that one laptop or desktop that you went through all the steps and set up and got an emulator running on. And let's say You're working with a collection, or you're working with someone who used several different kinds of computers. So they've got Commodore floppy disks, and they've got Apple II disks, and they've got IBM PC files. Every one of those hardware systems is going to require a different emulator, a different application, a different set of instructions, a different set of prerequisites. And that's a lot of legwork to, again, for either for us curators, librarians, archivists to have to do, or for your patron to have to follow through and learn. Pardon me. And where am I? Preservation paradox. So that's what we like to call another big problem, which is, if you're sort of following along here, you might be asking the question, well, wait a minute, if emulators themselves are applications and software, are we using software to save software? And the answer to that is yes, and there are issues with that. Computing doesn't just freeze and stop. Silicon Valley doesn't stop. They're going to keep making new Mac OS Windows versions. They're going to keep making tweaks to the computers that we use every day. And emulators themselves are pieces of software that can potentially break and become obsolete or incompatible with modern systems as a result. So there's an element of needing to constantly update and keep up with an already frantic technological pace. There's a problem in descriptive practice and just the sort of lack of structured metadata schema to talk about software, or to talk about the dependencies of certain types of files in or computing environments in the systems we tend to use for catalog or inventory. How do you talk about a floppy disk or a file that requires a certain version of a Windows operating system, that requires a certain version of Adobe Acrobat to open certain PDFs on that floppy disk? How do you integrate all of that information into a library catalog, into a collection management system, into a database, into an inventory? There's not a lot of structured schemas or ways of doing that out there to sort of lead by example. And the last big piece, which I'll address later on because it's actually possibly the way place where we've made the greatest strides in the past 20, 25 years. But for a long time, there's been a lack of a legal framework around doing this kind of work, of offering emulation for preservation and archival purposes. As again, you may have caught on at this point, in order to set up Windows 95 in an emulator, that requires us to have a copy of Windows 95. And those are often still pieces of proprietary software that have been left behind by their makers. But that copyright, that intellectual property has still been in sort of a legal gray area for a long time. There's never been a Supreme Court decision involving software plus copyright, so it's not to say that we can't do this, but there has just not been a lot of clarity from the United States judicial system around, is this an acceptable thing for nonprofit and cultural heritage organizations to do? And so at this point, I'm going to sort of slowly transition out of emulation as a whole into what we're doing on my grant project in particular to try and address some of these complexities. The first of which is actually elaborating on sort of the first half of our name. I mentioned we are the EASY project. We're the Emulation as a Service infrastructure project. And we're called that for a very particular reason, because there was a platform that was around before we were, called Emulation as a Service, or EAAS, that was made to address at least some of the complexities and the problems that I just presented. So what is EAAS? EAAS is a web-based, open source, browser-based platform that was originally developed by researchers at the University of Freiburg in Germany, actually, in the early 2010s. I think it was around 2011, 2012. And what that platform does is allow a sort of single entry access point to multiple emulators, multiple emulator applications. and thereby multiple hardware systems. So rather than having to go to many different places to find different applications to download and install and learn how to use, whether you're trying to use a generic PC, which is what there's an application called QEMU, Quick Emulator, that handles just sort of generic PCs from the 90s up until today. Whether it's the Apple II, there's the emulator called LinApple that handles Apple II emulation, an application called FSUAE that handles Amiga systems. Again, we're just taking all of these different hardware systems, all of these different applications, and centralizing them with EAAS. So that's one step to sort of help handle that problem of scale and usability. And using these applications, using these sort of centralized open source emulators, EAAS users are able to save and return to persistent emulation environments depending on your use case. And so that basically means if I need an Apple Mac OS 7.5, I'm probably going to need that many times in order to run many different pieces of software and access many different types of files. So I would just, rather than, again, having to have a bank of computers in front of me all running different operating systems, or even having to go through the trouble of setting that up in emulation on every patron's laptop, whoever needs Apple Mac OS 7.5, I can just keep returning in my browser to this list, to this one sort of machine out of many. And I could do that again, whether I need OS 9, or whether I need an Atari system, or whether I need a Mac OS 9 plus a certain version of QuickTime. We can mix and match and do all sorts of different combinations. Basically, every environment that exists in the emulation as a service platform is its own computer that we can boot up and use however we need in whatever context. And you can, and again, you can run these environments. You can actually, just like I booted up and played around with that Apple Mac OS version in front of you, you can do that with all of these emulators and with all of these environments in EAAS, only rather than running on your desktop, it's in a browser, and we can just send links to people to interact with these environments. And it's all just sort of on a centralized server, rather than having to again, do that sort of scattered, redundant work, honestly, of going to many different places and doing the setup work over and over again. So that finally leads me to what I do in the program that I work on day to day. And basically, to the I in that acronym, the infrastructure piece of emulation as a service infrastructure. So what we've done in our grant program, and just a little bit of quick context on us. Again, we're a Mellon and Sloan Foundation grant-funded project hosted at Yale University Library. Started in January 2018. Our first round of funding went for 2.5 years, but we have been funded for a second round. So now we're going through June 2022, which is very exciting. And basically what we're doing is taking that emulation as a service platform, taking some of those screenshots that I just showed you. We're taking that framework and we're making a program of work that looks wider to some of those other problems and complexities that I brought up earlier, like the metadata issue, or like the usability and the sort of documentation issues. We're trying to take this framework and investigate what it would take to deploy and scale infrastructure at cultural heritage organizations to actually offer emulation as a service, again, to patrons and researchers and collections on the level of hundreds of thousands, and just at a much wider scale than what is currently possible. And I'm going to do a quick second demo to show you our current version of the platform, again, so you can even quickly see some of our initial improvements to those screenshots. A lot of what we are doing is just funding development work on the user interface and sort of general aesthetics and usability of the platform. But basically what I can do here is using in this case, basically every sort of like bento box card that you're seeing here is again like one of the items on that list of like Apple Mac OS 7.5, Apple Mac OS 9. It's a different environment that I can return to and run in my browser. So if I want to run, say, Windows 98 plus Office 97, I could just click run that in Emulator. And again, this is all just via my browsers. It's hosted on Yale infrastructure. I'm in Massachusetts and it's booting up pretty quickly. We get to run Windows 98 and hopefully in a minute we'll even be treated to an old friend. But again, this is one of our sort of main forks of our work in the Easy project is just opportunities for better describing changes that people make to emulation environments, better describing the software that's installed in environments like this, making that all more structured. But I can open this up. I can run Office 97. Where's Clippy? There's Clippy. He's back. Unfortunately, you're never going to get rid of Clippy. So that's our again, quick overview of our current platform. Get my slides back again. And if we have some more time, I'm happy to play around in that some more. But that is really that sort of like software development piece is just one aspect of what we're doing. Under the concept of improving distributed management, we're trying to build, again, sort of community buy-in on this project, because again, the idea is that, I mean, we're going to need, in order to make emulation viable, we're going to need a community buy-in from a lot of different organizations, from a lot of different people, from a lot of different contexts and use cases. So to that end, we're building a network of partner institutions. We call them nodes. Basically, each of them offers some feedback on the platform you just saw and the work that we do. We are an affiliated project with the Software Preservation Network, who is a fantastic nonprofit organization that I highly recommend, if anything that I'm talking about today is of interest to you, check out their work and that other organizations are doing through the Software Preservation Network. But again, just to make sure we're talking to fellow practitioners and colleagues and making sure we're on the right track to build something that would be of use to people. And as we look towards the future and past our grant funding, we are investigating, business service models for consortial partnerships and hosting, because again, we know even this platform that I just demonstrated to you, it's not going to be something that every single public library or every single museum or archive is going to be able to set up for themselves. We absolutely need to look into consortial models so that sort of wider institutional buy-in can benefit the most number of people. We're also, part of what we're baking into the system is this idea of sharing resources. And basically, again, the idea if I at Yale need Windows 95, probably everyone else is going to need a copy of Windows 95. It was an extremely popular operating system with extremely popular software made for it. And there's, again, no reason why we should all have to do the work of trawling eBay or whatever you have to do these days in order to get copies of that software. Since we're doing this for nonprofit, for preservation, for archival reasons, we should be able to share those resources and eliminate some of that redundancy and scaling problems. So we are, again, one of the reasons why we're hosted at Yale is that Yale, over the past decade, did make a concerted effort to collect old versions of software installation media. So again, just the installation CD-ROMs and floppies for whatever old Corel, Microsoft, Apple software you need, your old WordPerfect, your old Office, your old Flash, your old whatever, your old AutoCAD versions. We have a lot of architectural designs. That's a big use case. That's, again, we're sort of trying to seed this network of institutions all using this software and all sharing resources with what we have so far, to, again, lighten the load on other people. Doing a lot of the metadata work, we are working with a project called Wikidata for Digital Preservation, which is essentially trying to use the Wikidata knowledge base as sort of the central platform by which we contribute and share information about software with each other. So that might just literally be the history of Microsoft Office versions, you know, and what year they came out, what file formats a particular version of a particular piece of software could handle is a big one. Needing to know, you know, could Microsoft Office 2003 open PDF 1.0? Pieces of information like that. We are, again, in trying to push the sort of like communal, decentralized nature of our work and of this project. We're trying to push Wikidata as the sort of communally owned place to put that info. We're working on that emulation platform to be able to you know, make sure that the schema that we're using, the database that drives our work, is all comprehensive, open, machine readable, well documented, and again, that we sort of expand the structured capabilities for describing a computing environment or describing software versions, whether it's, again, file format capability is a big one. Language capability. We discover a particular version of QuickTime could be switched to French, Spanish, Chinese, etc. Again, like finding out all that information and putting it into a structured profile. And lastly, of course, we're trying to, like, I mean, our general strategy is if we put the work into all those infrastructural pieces, we're going to lay a really great groundwork for then moving to the actual access piece of, like, how do library patrons, how do archival researchers and users of archives actually use these environments that I've been demonstrating for you and talking to you about. But we want to at least demo and start investigating strategies for, are there, you know, existing access platforms that we can integrate with? Are there services we can offer that make sense given what libraries, archives, museums already do? So to that end, we are, for most of 2021, going to be doing a pilot project with, again, the other members of the Software Preservation Network. We're mostly academic research libraries, some museums, a couple of other different, like, data curation organizations. But again, just sort of giving them all some more hands-on time with emulation, with our emulation platform, giving them guidance and finding out more about what their users and their patrons would want to do. And we're really looking forward to getting that feedback and sort of expanding the community of users, not just of the easy platform, but just of emulation, period. We are, I want to bring up, particularly for this group, might be of interest, like thinking about, we're calling it a CD-ROM sharing service, but it could be floppy disks. Basically, what we have in mind are like the CD-ROMs or the floppy disks that used to come in the back of, like, textbooks or of publications, and that are now, like, maybe you can request them through your library catalog, but then what's your patron supposed to do with a floppy disk or a CD-ROM if they don't have a drive, et cetera, et cetera. And this would essentially be a service, honestly, along the lines of what the Internet Archive National Emergency Library was trying to do, although obviously that could get complicated now, but basically saying, like, okay, if you can prove to us you have this physical CD-ROM, we will provide you with a link to that CD-ROM running in emulation via our platform. And you can embed that into your catalog and lend it out one at a time to your users. We think that is a really critical way to move forward in terms of resurrecting all of those materials that are sitting on shelves and catalogs inaccessible or useful. And final big piece, there's this thing we're calling the Universal Virtual Interactor. It's an AI. Okay, I'm gonna skip that part. Honestly, you can go on our site and find out a little bit more about that particular piece of the project. But I sort of want to wrap up and make sure that I leave everyone with some thoughts and some resources at the end of this discussion, because all of those things are really, I hope, really exciting to everyone. I'm also very cognizant of the fact that we're laying a lot of groundwork for future services that may not be available for several years, and that's not going to be very helpful if someone comes in tomorrow with a floppy disk, or next week, next month. So what I want to sort of like leave some considerations with, if you are intrigued by all of this and considering pursuing emulation as a strategy for helping your patrons or for providing access to digital materials. When you go out and start looking for how to actually do this, it's not you. The documentation is scattered. Again, I'll just say, like, those emulators, those applications, they are not aimed at librarians and information professionals. They are aimed at often very seclusive retro computing hobbyist communities who are kind of insular, and that knowledge is often trapped up in there, and so it is difficult often to figure out, get started using these things. And so, like I say, that's not you, although I'm going to, again, provide some resources and some helpful places for where I got started, at least. So, and as you go forward, search engines, Googling, user forums, whether it's for emulator applications themselves, or again, some of these sort of like gaming communities, retro hobbyist computing communities, and just other colleagues and peers and professionals in the digital preservation, digital archives field, going to be your best source of information and help right now. We're, again, doing all this work on the Emulation as a Service platform, hoping it will help a lot of people, serve a lot of needs. But right now, the name of the game is really building a community of practice. And just the more people we get interested in emulation, the more people we get trying emulation, the more people we get talking about emulation and believing in it and pushing it, that's going to help do so much help in moving this forward. And the last thing you're going to come across is, again, if you're trying to do any emulation, is this concept and term of abandonware, which is, again, software that is proprietary, maybe not, still under copyright, still owned by a commercial company that may or may not still exist. Again, whether it's Microsoft or some older, once great software vendor like Corel or Borland that has since gone under. And it kind of returns to that copyright concern and the legal gray area. And I want to try and assuage some of that before, like, you even get there, in terms of, like, can I use this abandonware, or can I use this software that I found on this site? And I'm going to point to, like, what I consider kind of required reading for anyone interested in emulation for, again, cultural heritage purposes, which is, a couple of years ago, the Association of Research Libraries produced a document called the Code of Best Practices in Fair Use for Software Preservation. It's a very readable, not that long document. Read the whole thing, because it just provides a very thoughtful framework under guidance from copyright lawyers and fair use experts and legal counsel across the country, providing a framework that the same principles of fair use that allow us to create parodies and then do all sorts of wonderful things, like the Google Books project, and like clipped text search, those same principles can apply in contexts where we are trying to use old proprietary software for the purpose of providing access to materials that would otherwise be inaccessible or unacceptable without that software. And this is sort of a choice quote from that document, which is that the copyright concerns that have largely guided this conversation for almost 20 years were not misplaced. We think the fears are over coming after libraries or archives for using an old copy of Office in order to open a old file. And in fact, some the contrary of informal discussions we've had where hush-hush representatives from the company saying, yeah, if your institution already has a Microsoft Office subscription for the latest 365 or whatever, we would view that as a retroactive license for all previous versions. So that's just a note to try and empower you all to read that, to say that your mission matters. Like in terms of the mission of nonprofit libraries of archives, that does make a difference versus and many of the conversations you'll see online, the communities around the copyright and intellectual property concerns around downloading and using and emulating old software. You are different, you have a different mission, you have a different use. And again, by the of and I'm sure we're going to share these slides, at which point I just want to share some particular resources, including our project website for the grant, which again, if you're interested in more news and resources, any of our events in terms of what we're doing or what other people in the Software Preservation Network are doing, please check out the Software Preservation Network website and our project site there. I maintain a sort of GitHub portal, which is, it's just basically a ton of links with some guidance around if you need Commodore, if you need a certain type of PC, if you need a certain era of Apple machine or a particular piece of software, use this emulator. Here are tutorials that people have already written. Here are some useful blog posts. Here are some articles. I try to keep that up to date, and I like to think it's, again, a pretty good portal at this point to launch off and dive deeper into this topic. And I'd also want to highlight that sort of in conjunction with that service pilot that we're doing with the Software Preservation Network next year, there is going to be a public, or at least to some degree, public-facing user forum launched. That, again, the hope being that we can build a wider community of practice, and that anyone who, again, is at an archive, at a library, at a museum, and is interested in emulation, interested in learning more, interested in getting help from other people who are trying these same things, can come and ask each other questions and link resources and share knowledge. So please watch out for that one launching in February 2021. At that point, my apologies for network activity issues. I hope it doesn't mess up the recording too much, but I would really like for you. Thanks so much for listening today.
Great, thank you so much, Ethan. I'm gonna start my video up now. Yeah, so anybody have any questions for Ethan starting off about emulation or?
I have a question. And thank you, Ethan, for your work on all the emulation, because I know this is definitely an issue that we're going to be encountering as we go along. My question is, if we encounter files or that we do not have access to an emulator to find, would a good practice be to upload a copy to a cloud storage, so that way we can access it later and run it in an emulator that when it gets developed?
Yeah, I mean, certainly what we're talking about with emulation, right? It's an access strategy, right? We need the preservation work of a file just existing in the first place to be done one way or another. So absolutely, like doing data backup and keeping original files should be sort of the, in whatever format, whether it's backing up to a cloud service, whether it's making multiple copies on drives and sharing. That's the number one priority, right? Because there is an element of sorry, did you say something there? I'm sorry, I'm cutting out a little bit.
No.
Just to say that, like, you're absolutely right that because of the sort of developing nature of all of this, it could be that a solution is found later to a file you can't access today.
Yeah, and this is sort of a follow-up question. Should I really be keeping all of those CD-ROMs and like of software and floppies of software that I just can't throw away because I keep thinking, what if I have the only copy? Or is there someone I can send those to?
Right now, yes, please, to send them to me and donate them to the Easy Project. My DMs are open. It is our hope that, again, part of the work with contributing metadata and sort of building a larger database of knowledge around software includes who has what software, so that, right, we can reach the point of saying, like, rather than just telling everyone save everything, that at some point we can say, it's okay, we have enough copies of Adobe Reader 4.0 or whatever it is. You can safely ditch that.
Very good to know. Very good to know. Anybody else have questions? Because yeah, I absolutely, I mean, for our memory lab, we've had people come in and bring floppies in, and they're able to see the files, on the floppy in the Finder window. But yeah, all we can tell them is just to put it onto a new storage medium. If it is some sort of text document, to you could potentially at least have access to the text, not like the formatting or anything if you open it up in a text reader. But are there other workarounds that are like not necessarily preservation that you know about? Like, let's say it was like a different type of image format that they can't open, but is there a way of, I mean, once again, not emulation, but of just like changing the, the extension of the file and then see if that or something.
Well, that's why, again, I don't like thinking of migration as like an opposition to emulation. Migration might be, or doing some sort of conversion or some sort of manipulation like you're describing, right? Changing a file extension, plugging it into some other computer that some other software that really creates a new file, but it's a new file that gets you something usable. Again, that might be the acceptable thing to do in the short term. I guess what I'm saying is keep the original while you investigate the emulation option. But absolutely, like, we're all just trying to get usable. It's all about getting something usable to our patrons. I understand that frustration of, okay, I did the whole process of getting it off this floppy. It's the whole big deal with the physical device, but I still can't do anything with this. And emulation can be a complicated thing to add on top of that, which is why we're working to make it easier. But sometimes it's like, okay, yeah, I got some weird deleted text when I opened this Word document in Office 365, but okay, now then I deleted that weird formatting. I fixed the formatting. I deleted the deleted text again, and that's the solution. Sure, that gets you there.
Right. Yeah. So everyone, that would be a good thing if someone asks you, like, what can I do? I just want to view the file or something. I think the best advice to give them would be to, maintain that original file as like their thing that they're not going to touch, but then they can make a copy of it and try and fiddle around with those other options from that copy to see if they can get something out of it that's usable that they want. But at least then they can go back. Like, it's always about being able to go back to that original file, but not the original floppy. We want to be done with the floppy. Like, let's be done with the floppy disk. And I mean, this is also something interesting that, like, we initially in the memory lab did not have plans for optical disk readers, and expecting people to want to have access to those, because they were pretty ubiquitous. I mean, when the memory lab was even starting to be planned was 2015, so it was way more of a chance that you would have a disk reader, so that's like a CD, DVD reader in your computer, right? But that's just, it's 2020 now, and that's just a thing of the past. And so that's something too to think about, is getting one that you can buy pretty cheaply, like an optical disk reader that you just plug in via USB. And that's in particular for people who were saving files to like data disks. So yeah, that's the other thing of, like, you open a box or someone brings in a box of their stuff, and, you know, I feel like they could have CD-ROMs in there that have software, but then they could have some CDs that have files on them. And then they could also have CDs that are just musical, like total commercial music. So luckily, like, floppies, I feel like they were just used for the two things. But yeah, so just be aware that is something that you guys are gonna, I think more and more people are gonna be looking into. I don't know also if you guys have any of this type, like floppies, in your collections as well. That's more me just being curious about your local collections.
I'm kind of curious about the publications piece as well, like whether, right, again, like, did anyone keep those CD-ROMs that came along with books and textbooks and things?
I know, right? I feel like those would just get like weeded out.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe not. I do remember also that for my high school yearbooks, we always had like a CD insert at the end of stuff. I mean, that's not software, but it made me.
No, it is. Yes,
yeah,
it is.
Yeah, I mean, it does. Yeah. I mean, their files need to be read by software, but yeah. I'm wondering where those are, and worried about them now.
Well, and we have a lot of, I mean, people use the yearbooks in our collection all the time. So that supplemental information would be really important, I would think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the whole reason why we did it was because it was like, we had to turn in the printed stuff in like January, you know, and this entire other half of the year where you needed to like have, so that's why we did the supplement. Yeah.
I personally have a box of floppies, a box of jazz discs, and zip discs that are my master's thesis. And I have my master's thesis on a cloud somewhere, you know, I mean, but I keep those. It's like my sentimental, I don't plan on ever doing anything with them, but it's my like little sentimental thing, you know, so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, totally. I do keep like certain things just to remember and be like, oh my God, this was on the physical thing, and like to prove to people that that's how, I don't know, like future generations, that this is how it worked. But yeah, as long as you got the content off, right, and you can access it, then
it's fascinating. I actually work with a team of student workers at Yale who do some of the work of just like trying and installing old software and emulation for us, and it's becoming more and more of a project, like each year, to even like get them in the frame of reference of what we're talking about in terms of they're just getting further away from ever having even used a floppy. Hopefully at this point they know what CD-ROMs are even, and that's kind of wild. It's most of the training, the education is having to go back and teach them, here's how to use Windows 95. Here are like weird user behaviors in Mac OS 8 that we've all sort of knew and forgotten. And it's really interesting actually, because it's just like, that's what it's going to be moving forward, right? Like that's who everyone's patrons are going to be. Are like, we are no longer going to be able to assume that people who are interested in collection materials, digital collection materials, were around when those things were originally created and know how to use these environments, know how to use these systems. So that's an interesting challenge for me moving forward, is how do we also create instructions for, okay, you opened the file in emulation, now what? Now I have Windows 95. What if I never used Windows 95? What do I do? Yeah.
That's such a good point. That's such a good point. And it's also, I mean, not to get too, I think like emulation is great. Emulation is the way, right? But it's also like doesn't even preserve all aspects of that experience of, you know, like it's the best it's what we can do to have access to these things and to kind of understand the way that like the hardware interacted with the software and things like that. But yeah, there's nothing quite like actually physically putting the floppy in there and like, you know, ejecting it and things like that. Yeah, and making sure.
Yeah, we have to be careful about.
Yeah.
We have to be careful about, you know, still being as accurate as we can about describing, that mediation process and like what we did to provide access to the material. But in that way, there is a fair amount of archival theory around that in any case, right? There's always, with physical collections, redaction and or whatever processing, there's always been that step of curation and often like done before we give up access to collections. So it's just challenging because it's a new vocabulary and it's a new system that people aren't used to, and that again we just have to talk about more and more to get people on our page.
Absolutely. And that's in the chat, people are saying like, you know, it's reminiscent of like old record players, right? Where I think probably of certain generations, like around my age, maybe a little bit younger, didn't know about records for the most part. Like they just didn't even know how to use a record player to hear music. And now it's like, I feel like there was an article saying that like LP record sales like surpassed like CDs or something the other week. Amazing. So it's like it's having a comeback. Yeah. But
I love this. I'll share. There's an example that we've recently worked with, or we are working with. Stanford University is one of our partners, and they recently acquired a large collection of material from the Voyager company, who, if anyone remembers, like they were like big in multimedia interactive CD-ROMs in like the late 80s, most of the 90s. And like one of the discs that they were showing in emulation recently was they released, like with the Criterion collection, when Criterion was doing like laser discs and interactive CD-ROMs, a version of A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles. And like they were showing the CD-ROM, and the image is the size of a postage stamp, but the interactivity, like the indexing, was wild. You could like click on certain people's names and go to different timestamps. The entire script was lined up with the image and with the transcript. Like they're doing things with transcription and with audio and with indexing, like and supplementary materials that our streaming platforms that everyone is on now are like just now getting back to. And which is wild to see. So it is just like, yeah, have you seen A Hard Day's Night on CD-ROM? Like, in some ways, it might be the best experience.
Right. Oh man, yeah. People are gonna. I want to see that now. Yeah. Like, how do I have access? And maybe people will start like writing each other little notes on and in text files and sending floppy disks. to each other. I feel like
I would love that as a way to take control back of our data. Just bring back
right.
floppies.
Yeah, that's a good point. Cool. And yeah, okay. Heather's saying CD and DVD might come back. Yeah. I know, right? It's like I just think it's really important to just keep talking, like you've said, Ethan, like keep talking about how these this various media and their physical media, you know, but digital files and held digital media, how they exist, that they existed, when and how. And because yeah, it's like something that sometimes I even forget, like that you had to do all that just to like boot your computer. But then it comes back, and then I think that it's something we're going to see a lot in the memory labs, and a lot of like appreciation for it, not just for nostalgia's sake either. I do think that just seeing like how far we've come, technology has come in such a short amount of time, really. And it is, I think, an opportunity for like younger folks to kind of connect with older content and things like that. And
just the last thing that I'll plug is that, I mean, we're thinking about it from right now moving forward as well. Like, again, like the things that, you know, it's sort of easiest to talk about this in the context of floppies and CD-ROMs and stuff from the 90s, 80s, whenever. But again, all the same principles are going to apply to software and files that were made last week. And in fact, those things might break at an even faster rate at the way that Silicon Valley is going, and these big tech companies are working on things. So can we use emulation to sort of package up things as they're created, and be cognizant of the fact that obsolescence is going to happen, that the software is going to go bad, that the files are going to no longer open, and think in a forward way about the way technology works now that we have 25, 30, 40 years of personal computing experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that just like your project is so hopeful and inspiring, and also makes me realize what a West it is out there, you know, like type of stuff. But that's fantastic. Thank you so much for helping us today, for coming and sharing your knowledge and your project, and those resources are going to be key. So yeah, if anyone has any last questions, or you can always, if you don't mind, Ethan, they can email you. I know you provided your email.
Always. Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. And yeah, I think the point that Ethan made is a good one to end on, of the fact that this is also why you teach your digital preservation classes, right? Because just because it's very hard to get the files off of the floppy or the CD, or even just like any external hard drive, after that, there's still so much work to do for preservation. So keep.
And we need all hands on deck.
All hands on deck, absolutely. And yeah, our memory labs are the front line for the public. So you guys just let me know how I can help you going forward. Let me know if you have ideas for webinars. And you know, if you guys are coming up with slide decks for your public on whatever topic, if you want me to just like take a look, I can do that too. Like, just let me know how I can help you. And I will see you all again sometime in October for our next webinar.